Hi, listeners. Welcome back to Adopting the Podcast. As always, I'm so excited to be your host for this journey. I'm Nicole Witt, Executive Director of the Adoption Consultancy, where we guide pre-adoptive parents step by step through the adoption journey. In Adopting the Podcast, we're going to focus on the issues, questions, and concerns you have as you get started in your adoption journey. This is for people who are just considering adoption, brand new to adoption, or early in the process, who are just trying to kind of get their questions answered, figure out their best path forward, learn about what to expect and how the process works. In previous episodes, we've touched on one of the greatest fears of pre-adoptive parents, which is a match falling through. Specifically matching with an expectant mom up until the baby is born, and then her choosing to parent instead of placing the child for adoption. Now, very few pre-adoptive parents would begrudge her making that decision, but that doesn't make it hurt any less. And that's the piece we're going to focus on today. With a failed match, of course, there can be some financial loss, and there's obviously time that has been lost, and I'm not trying to discount those. But today we're going to focus on the emotional loss to manage that. So to do so, I would like to welcome Catherine Roth. She's counselor and infant family specialist with Empowered Life. She is a licensed clinical social worker who has been providing therapeutic and support services to women, children, and families since 2009. Catherine began her career in child welfare by providing counseling and case management services to families with open child abuse and neglect cases. She switched gears to begin working at a nationwide domestic adoption agency specializing in open adoption as an adoption coordinator and birth parent intake counselor. In 2014, she began providing therapeutic services in a private practice to women and adoptive parents and families, and she continues to do so today. Again, currently, Catherine operates Empowered Life, a highly specialized practice providing women with counseling and adoption support services. Thank you so much for being here, Catherine.
Hi, Nicole. Thanks so much for having me.
Sure. Before we dig in, I want to lay the groundwork with a few key points that I think are important for everyone to understand. The first one is that failed matches don't happen as people think that they do. You know, the numbers that you hear kicked around a lot, and there aren't any hard and fast statistics on this, but the numbers you hear kicked around is that it happens in the ballpark of about 30% of the time or so. That feels a little bit high to me. I think that includes all kinds of circumstances. You know, people who are working with disreputable sources, people who are meeting each other, online, which certainly can work out very well sometimes, but does increase the risk of fall throughs. I would say with the reputable agencies and attorneys that I work with, it probably happens closer to the ballpark of 15% of the time. So it certainly does happen, and it is a real risk of adoption. And I recognize that if it happens to you, it's happened 100% of the time, and you don't really care about the statistics. But just kind of heading into this, I want people to understand that it's not something that happens, the majority of the time with adoptions. Also, if the adoption does fall through, it's almost always at the hospital after the baby has been born. It's extremely rare for an expectant mom who has made an adoption plan to change her mind on that during the course of the pregnancy. That does happen sometimes, but it's almost always after the birth. And the last key point I want to lead with is that today we are talking about honest changes of heart, right? We are not talking about people who are out there purposely trying to scam the system. We have covered that in another episode, which you can go back and listen to. But we are talking about a woman who gives birth, who is experiencing all those emotions and has an honest change of heart. And frankly, when that happens, she's often more surprised than anyone, right? So even though there are certainly, things that we can look at and possible red flags and so on, if she doesn't see it coming, it can be extremely difficult for anybody on the outside to kind of see it coming. So I just wanted to lay the groundwork with that. With all of that said, Catherine, can you start with some general comments about the benefits of counseling for both expectant parents, birth parents, and adoptive parents?
Sure. So Benefits to counseling, I think there are just many. First of all, you're working with someone who is, non-judgmental and has a non-biased approach to services with you and is also removed from your situation. So they're really able to kind of guide you and give you that therapeutic support from a place where, again, they're really not involved in the situation, but if you fully support you. And with that being said, as it relates to counseling for adoptive parents, I think there's a great benefit as it relates to grief and loss for birth parents and adoptive parents, but specifically for adoptive parents who are coming into adoption process and then ready to experience some loss related to infertility. Mm-hmm. And they might have experienced, loss related to miscarriage, and even really that loss of that hope or dream or desire to have a biological child. And counseling is a place where that can really be unpacked and even just help with the grieving process, as well as to, really simultaneously still address that piece as you're going through the adoption process. Because with any type of loss, when we're grieving, it's ongoing. And so that's something that very much so can be triggered in the adoption process, our past losses that we've had related to creating a family. And then in general, too, that adoption process, it's very anxiety and stress provoking. And so having that support from a counselor can be really helpful and how to manage and cope with some of the stress and anxiety that comes up in this process. And then even looking to, after, you've had placement of your child and, you have your little one in the home with you, there are other pieces that could really be helpful too in counseling, which would be, working with a counselor on attachment and bonding with your child, and even raising your adopted child and different considerations that might come up in your parenting. One that comes to mind most often that adopted parents, wonder about or need some support in how to approach this topic is how and when to talk to your child about adoption and how to share with them their story. So those are all some benefits that I see for counseling for adoptive parents all across the board.
Yeah, those are great points. And circling back to just one of them, and this is a little tangential and probably worthy of a whole separate episode, is that idea of grieving the loss up front. And like you said, it stays with you. It's not something like, okay, check, I've grieved that and that's past me now. But I find that it's very important when people approach adoption that, the people who are much more successful with it, both emotionally and in multiple other ways, are people who kind of come to it with more of the attitude of, okay, everything that I went through, with infertility treatment and so on, that was terrible, right? But that's behind me. That was the end of one chapter. I'm at the beginning of a new chapter and I'm really excited. And this is a totally different process that works, right? Versus the people who kind of come to it going, okay, well, nothing has worked so far, so adoption is just my next step of what I have to do, and this, probably won't work either. Obviously they have a much more negative and less successful experience with the whole process. So, I do think that is so valuable to get that counseling help to be able to shift that mindset before you even start, the adoption process.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful to even be aware of that and that need that you might have before even starting the adoption process, and even just checking in with yourself throughout the adoption process and keeping in mind that things might come up for you that are triggering and are bringing back up some of full force, some of those emotions and grief related to those past losses related to fertility and what have you. And so I think that's something to just for adoptive parents to keep in mind, that it can be helpful at any point.
Yeah, absolutely. So shifting towards talking about disrupted matches specifically, what have you seen to be as key factors when this happens?
So what I've seen from the families that I've worked with and even, expectant and birth parents, that there usually is a shift or change in that birth parent support system, whether that is a family member or a friend, birth father, another loved one that, is stepping forward or even really speaking with more, commitment to saying that they're here and willing to support birth mom and parenting. And that can be a game changer for some birth parents, because that was a piece of what was leading them to make this adoption plan and feeling that they weren't going to have anybody willing to support them, or even sometimes their family has said, we will disown you, not speak to you, you can't live with us if you do make this adoption plan and you place this, your child for adoption, and here, babies has a choice to make that's pretty emotional and very, difficult in the sense of, if I do make this choice and this family is not going to speak to me anymore. That's a lot to take on. Or on the other end, like I said before, is that a family member, friend, another loved one or birth father is stepping forward and saying, we're willing to commit to helping parent. And that could, like I said, be one that would be a big factor in changing her decision to place at that time.
Yeah, for sure.
Another one that I tend to see is that, some birth parents, they haven't gotten the option for counseling because they chose not to or it wasn't, given to them. But most, referral agencies do get that option for them. But also if they, one way that they handle their emotions throughout this process is to suppress them. And, again, grieving starts even from day one in this process for adoptive parents, where that initial stage is denial. And denial is powerful, and we can compartmentalize that and kind of put it in that imaginary box in the closet and not really take a look at it. And now here's this reality setting in. Baby's born, baby's here, and she can become very overwhelmed with these emotions and even just the reality of now this decision that I'm making. It's, here it is. And it might be too difficult. And she might be in a place where, she hasn't learned, throughout that process or even really expected what was becoming at this time. And so just the overwhelming nature of it all can lead to a place of, I can't make this choice and decision, even though this is something I had initially planned for. And with that being said, it's something that she no longer feels that is the right fit for her, right choice for her and her baby is to make that adoption plan.
Right.
And that's something I've seen, happen before. And then also even, something I've seen come up is just that change in feeling like it's a good fit for her with the adoptive family that she's picked, something that, again, having those high emotions that maybe haven't been processed, throughout that process, and just having some, again, part of grief is another stage is anger, as resentment is self-blame, is blame of others. All kind of go hand in hand in that stage. And so at that time, and that's coming up, maybe around when baby's born, is that this resentment or anger towards herself that she isn't in a place to parent, or that she's chosen this family to parent and she's not in a place where she feels like I can go through with this and make this because, again, those emotions are just too much. And so she's no longer feeling like that family is a good fit or is meeting the needs that she has, and therefore no longer wants to place. And so to me, it's really related to the grief and loss and the emotions that go along with that, and how is that being tended to, and how are we working and supporting birth parents to have some anticipatory grief and loss like education, so that it isn't something that becomes so overwhelming and overpowering to a place where we're just wanting to be comforted, remove these unpleasant feelings, and they're not comfortable, they're not enjoyable, and the thought of this loss of placing baby is too much, where again women may decide to parent and feel like this is what the only option is because I don't want to feel this way.
Right. It's a very interesting take on it. I appreciate that. Are disrupted matches a significant part of the issues that you address with families?
No, that's not necessarily the main focus. I would say that does come up in some of the clients that I've worked with, but I wouldn't say that's the main focus. Because as you mentioned earlier, it isn't something that is very common. And in my opinion and experience, many adoptive families who have experienced like a disruption had been given some feedback or even some warning of things that might be changing or shifting by their adoption professional. And just like you said earlier, it doesn't mean that it doesn't bring hurt and pain. Again, that's something that I see as being like the main focus. I'm working with families and counseling.
Okay. So how do you guide families through the experience of a failed match?
Really, I think it's starting with a place where you create a space for them to process and tell their story. Because again, it's something that's had such a huge impact on them, and even being able to identify what that has been and allowing them that space to kind of unpack that is where I like to begin. And then also even helping them recognize this as a loss, and a loss always grieve, and how to really be on the lookout for what is coming up for them individually, because again, even if they are together as a couple, adoptive parents I'm seeing, both of them individually will be experiencing this loss in their own way that might be very different from one another. And so allowing them to see those differences, but also be supportive to one another and be supportive to themselves. And so in acknowledging that, this is a loss that might be bringing up previous losses they've had, such as, loss